Welcome to everybody. I'm Jeff Gedman with American Purpose. I've been looking forward to this conversation for some time with two people I respect enormously. First of all, to Mark Pomar. Mark, great to see you. I recall, like yesterday, you telling me in a cafe outdoors at the Cosmos Club that you had a book idea and you were just beginning. And wow, you did it. And it's a fantastic read. It's called Cold War Radio, the Russian broadcast of Voice of America and for your Free Liberty. It's just out. And it really is a nice read because it's solid information, your personal professional experience, and terrific storytelling. And I can't think of a better person to run this conversation than Martha Bayles, who is a contributing editor at American Purpose, who teaches at Boston College, who wears other hats and has other affiliations. But Martha is a book author, an essayist, an op-ed writer, reviewed your book in the Wall Street Journal just a few days ago. When you have a chance, Michelle, if you would put that in chat, it's a fine review, both because it's favorable in its judgment of the book, but it's substantive and it's interesting. And among the many things that Martha does exceptionally well, she has deep knowledge and experience in the study of American public diplomacy and this thing called U.S. international media, or whatever you want to call it. That's my piece. Thanks, everybody, for making time. What a fabulous group. Martha, you have the floor, your show, and thanks for being here.
Okay, thank you. It's really good to be here, and it's good to see the names, if not the faces, but also faces of this assemblage. I keep scanning the screen to check out who's here. Mostly, I'm glad to meet you, Mark. I was a little cautious when they asked me to review the book because I was afraid it was going to be a sort of memoir of things I did back in the day. And I took a look at it and I started reading it. And then I realized that it is a memoir of things I did back in the day to the large extent, but it's also an exploration of so many aspects of this enterprise that are hard to explain to people and that I think a lot of people would like to wish away. Also, and then as I emphasized in the review, your discussion of the programming, that's the real gold mine here, because as you note, and as I have noted, very few people actually get into the nitty-gritty of the programming. And because you were in a single language in two different agencies, you just, that was your thing. And the discussions of the programs are prolonged, but they're wonderful and they're very rich and informative. So that's a key thing about the book that I think is really good. But I want to start with something a little, I don't know, a little, it's a preoccupation of anyone who gets their head around this system to any degree. And I'd say I had my head around it to a fair degree, but not completely. I've certainly never worked in it. And that is all the tensions, the constant tensions that somebody in the positions that you held had to negotiate on a day-to-day basis. And I've got a list of them here. And I'm just curious to hear your comments on each one in order. And I'll start with one that I think is rather salient nowadays in a different form, but it's the same old tension. I've been getting the impression from various sources that there's a lot of tension between the Ukrainian service or the efforts to communicate with Ukraine and the Russian program, which I guess is called Current Time these days. And that there's this is typical that people in the different language services are so intent on what's going on in their own countries that they chafe against some of their fellow language services. This is difficult for an American to manage or to even understand. And I don't understand it. I'm just telling you what I sense in the wind. So I'd be curious what you would have to say, maybe on a more general basis, of how you manage tensions between language services, and we can get to within language services by these large emigre communities that work for these services, who are, you know, not always getting along in a harmonious way.
Well, thank you very much, Martha, and thank you for the review. And it's great to know that so many friends are on. Tom Dine, Arch Puddington, Tom Ilves, and others who were my colleagues and friends. And I'm really thrilled to have them, even though I don't see them. Your question, Martha, is a very, very important one, because really tension is probably a very good way to describe radio or international broadcasting for many different reasons. And one I would toss out immediately is the fact that when you have a closed society, as the Soviet Union was, or which is Russia is today, in a sense, the public forum for the discussion of politics of that country inevitably becomes something that the emigres are only free to discuss. In other words, those who've escaped, those who have come out, are able, and what the radios were in my time in the 1980s, they were the public forum in which different groups, and I'm speaking in this case of the Russians, were playing out, arguing, debating what might a future Russia, Soviet Union look like. And of course, the radios included a whole host of different approaches, from right to center to left. I mean, the center, luckily, was the dominant one, but there were obviously people on different. And so that tension came together. And then you have to also throw in the fact that you had an American management. With all due respect to American management, they did not, for the most part, know the languages, nor could you know all the languages that involved at Radio Liberty or VOA. So there was that tension coming down, where there was some misunderstanding of what these particular broadcasters wanted to emphasize. I would also say that in terms of today, and I really do want to make the plug for it, I'm a regular, occasional guest on Current Times in Russia, Radio Liberty on VOA. So I'm on the air in a very different role. I have to say what I have seen is really outstanding. I give kudos to today's RFERL and today's VOA and the program Current Times, which brings it together, which I think is among the best programs. I start my day by looking at that as to what's happened in Ukraine. But I think the tensions go deep. When I was USSR division chief at VOA, I had the responsibility of overseeing not just the Russian service, but also the Ukrainian service, the Uzbek service, the Azerbaijani service, the Georgian service, the Armenian service. And I'll tell you, the tension between Armenians and Azeris over Nagorno-Karabakh was astounding. I mean, literally, virtually fistfights in the corridors. So, I mean, the tensions are always there. That's part of what makes it both exciting and important.
Yeah, it's herding lion, not cats, but lions and tigers.
And also because the situation in their home countries
Yeah.
is so difficult. I mean, that's part of what, and in emigre societies in general, things tend to be elevated to a higher emotional pitch. I think that's just inevitable to any emigre society of any country.
Mhm. The one reason why I'm starting with these questions is because everyone, I think, is mindful of the fact that your book is about the 80s and into the 90s, when you were post-Cold War, your responsibilities at the BIB, sort of restructuring and sort of recreating the institutions and the agencies in an atmosphere where a lot of people wanted to shut them down, and there was a lot of debate about that. I'd really like to ask you about that. So I guess that's next. Your sort of the post career after the end of the Cold War, you didn't abandon the scene. You were very active in the sort of the miasma of the bureaucracy and all that. And I'm curious what you might recall from that would be useful for us to think about today.
Well, everybody wanted the peace dividend once the Soviet Union fell apart. And I think that, as I recall, the Clinton administration actually zeroed out RFERL in the first year. And that, of course, caused a lot of anxiety at the Board of International Broadcasting, where I was the executive director, and Steve Forbes and I did a lot of visits to Capitol Hill to talk to a number of people saying this is not the time to do it. And in many ways, it's the leaders of Central Europe, in particular Václav Havel, but also Valenza and others, who really also told Washington this is not a wise way to follow. But I will point out that the person who stands in my mind, and I recall so vividly, as the savior of the radios was none other than Senator Joseph Biden. Who responded extremely positively to us, came to our board meetings, spent hours of time talking to us, made sure that I had, I was working very closely with his staff at that time, and really managed to bring together enough people on the Hill to make sure that the radios got some kind of, and that's where the BBG comes out of. I am guilty, and I plead guilty to being one of 4 people sitting in a room in a law office trying to map out what a future broadcasting entity could be. I didn't have much of a choice. I was told that's what we should be doing, but we tried as best as we could to structure something that could survive what was at that time a very triumphal moment in American history, where the world was turning, had turned in our direction, and therefore, why do we need these relics of sort of the Cold War, to quote Fulbright from before? So I was involved in that. Much soon after that, I left and went on to do other public diplomacy work at IREX and at the
Mhm.
U.S Russia Foundation. But I mean, I was involved very much at that time, and I think that what Biden really understood so well, and he had support from Senator Kerry and Senator Lugar and others who were very, very supportive, was that this was something that we should continue. But I will add that in that process, we did develop a metric for language services that could close in time. And of course, several language services on the RFE side did indeed close in the 90s. Part of following a approach that we had taken at the BIB as being reasonable and understanding that in the case of VOA had a future no matter what. I mean, that was a separate entity. RFERL, having been created as surrogate radio stations, obviously were there for such time as the countries themselves could take over and do the broadcasting themselves.
Although they reshuffle language services in VOA too all the time, don't
Absolutely. And priorities came in terms of where you needed it. And of course, going forward into the 21st century with Middle East becoming the center, a lot of things developed.
I think there was a period when everyone was very critical of the BBG, and of course, there's always reason to have criticized the BBG. And one wag, I forget who it was, said, the way you can tell where the next trouble spot in the world is the BBG closes that language service. This is always
Well,
followed by a crisis.
I would say that looking back, there was always, criticism was part of the game in Washington anyway. But I would say, coming back to the 1980s, and I would like to, and you're absolutely right. I really wrote the book to try to communicate what the programming was. And I did it for many different reasons, one of which is there's a tremendous ignorance as to what we broadcast. I can even tell you a story. I was reading the Foreign Affairs magazine about a year ago, and a very distinguished, I will not mention obviously his name, professor of international relations, wrote something so patently wrong about the radios that I actually wrote him a very polite note saying, sir, didn't know him, but I said, you really ought to read what I'm saying, because you're just making statements that have no bearing on reality whatsoever. And I make this point early in the book, in that people sort of assume what they want or don't want of the radios to do whatever we did. We were very different from most perceptions, and the difference really was embedded in the programming. And that's why I wanted to communicate the extent to which the radios were serious, important, maybe sometimes too serious in their programming, and you need to lighten it up sometimes. But it was a really, we took it very, very seriously. And the other thing that I make a point of in the book, which I think may come as a surprise to most people, is that news was not the major part of our program. Everybody assumes all we did was news.
Yeah.
Far and away, that's not the case. We did a lot of programming, as anyone reading the book will see, from human rights to religion to history to culture to literature to the arts to philosophy to book reviews and on and on and on. So there was just a lot in it. It was a very comprehensive approach.
Well, that brings me to my next category of tension, which is the tension between the missions. Now, there's 3 missions defined on the VOA charter from the 70s, which I think everyone here is aware of. And then there's these presumed differences and real differences between VOA and the grantees. At the time, it was just RFE-RL, but now we have many others, several others. And there's always a part of the misunderstanding on the domestic side is that these missions are very distinct and that all of these enterprises should be sticking very much to their mission. And of course, if you talk to anyone who's ever worked in the system, it's really hard to stick to one mission when you're running one of these language services, whether you're in the grantees or whether you're in VOA. And I think your book addresses that at so many points that I can't even single one out right now, but I'd be curious what you had to say, for example, between surrogate news or news reporting. Of course, surrogate news is probably the most important aspect of that, maybe, arguably. And then, cultural programming and so forth. And then, of course, the greatly vexed topic of public diplomacy and explaining American policy and debating American policy so that people understand what America's intentions are and so forth. Those 3 are the VOA charter, basically. But the way you tell it, it wasn't that easy to keep them apart. Or am I misreading you?
No, you're reading it quite right. And it's also a matter of the time when this happens. In other words, the 1980s, early 1980s, when I was there in the mid 80s, VOA was much freer for each language service to pursue what it felt was the right way to communicate. And so we had a lot of leeway, very explicitly stated by the director of VOA and by the general total management of VOA. So we were able to do, for example, far more what might be called surrogate broadcasting away than would have been the case in the 70s. But just to clarify very quickly, of course, VOA first and foremost looked at the American angle on stories. We covered, obviously, American politics far more than RFE-RL would, which would be very minimal. We also wanted to make sure we had an American perspective, but we felt perfectly comfortable, and we thought it was totally our natural role to interview, for example, Russian immigrants who were living in the United States who could give but they were very often interviewed by Radio Free or Radio Liberty as well, because they were proponents of Russian literature or culture or the arts and so forth. So they would be on the air in both stations, maybe with a different set of questions asked of them, so that when Rostropovich, the director of the New York of the Washington National Symphony, would be on, we would try to get him to talk about what it would be like to be free in the United States, running an orchestra or directing the National Symphony, rather than necessarily, although he could comment on anything he wanted, and we encouraged him to speak on any subject. So I would say that, yes, it is fuzzy. There is a different perspective. So when at RFE-RL, when we sat down in our morning sort of meeting to determine the programs of the day, the United States did not matter that much unless something major was happening. We really looked at issues concerning the Soviet Union, what was relevant, what was in Europe. There was a much heavier emphasis at Radio for Europe, since we were based in Munich, on a European perspective. We sat down at VOA. Of course, the first set was what's happening politically in the United States. What are the foreign policy issues we should be addressing? Are there major speeches given by the president or secretary of state or so on? So that perspective definitely happened. But then in the cultural programs, I think they inevitably became far closer in terms of content.
What do you think is the problem with under the Trump administration? Of course, the system was placed in a parlous situation
Hmm.
with a director who seemed more intent upon dismantling it than leading it. Um, and these things may happen again. But when you see those, we watch that unfolding, I was very aware, and I think a lot of everybody here was very aware of how kind of badly it was covered by the American media, the news media. Every single article I ever read, and there were quite a few, had a picture of VOA's sign. And you'd think VOA was the whole enchilada. There was very little understanding that there were, six different, five different broadcast entities and a sixth entity that was interested in internet openness and so forth. And there's just no grasp of the system at all. It's a very hairy monster to take a hold of. What would you like to see, or how do you think that problem could be approached? I mean, it was a problem then, and it's probably a worse problem now. These incredible misunderstandings of what it is. I don't know what the solution is, but I'm curious if you've reflected on that.
Well, a couple of things. First of all, I tell students at the University of Texas, where I teach a course occasionally, if you want a dissertation topic and you don't want to have a lot of competition and you want to have the field to yourself, look at the whole international, well, public diplomacy in general, but international broadcasting in particular. Since I said it will open up avenues to American foreign policy, to American interaction with the rest of the world that will be very important for the American public to know, for American universities and so forth to know. But I think there's a level of ignorance. And again, to come back to this very well-known professor of international relations who knows next to nothing about a subject that has been obviously in the news and is important for it. So I would start with the fact that it has not been integrated in and is not part of what students are taught when they deal with American foreign policy sufficiently, if at all. That's number one. The other, so there's just knowledge in the field, getting it out. And I think, unfortunately, the radios, I'm thinking back to to the Cold War era, were somehow plugged as a kind of a peripheral issue in the grand scheme of things. And I would say deeply misunderstood, and as a result, have not had their time in the sun, have not been known. And there's a lot there to it. And I don't mean necessarily all positive. I mean, some of the problems that arise out of it are also very important for understanding what is happening in the world. And in the book, I don't make a very heavy point. Maybe I would if I were writing the book today rather than a couple of years ago. The extent to which we can see, for example, Russia's behavior in the war in Ukraine coming out of a certain part of the Russian political culture that was reflected in some of the programs of the radios, for the simple reason that the radios reflected all different points of view of the Russian political culture, and the views that Mr. Putin is now propounding were very much present in some of the history programs that I describe, and were part of the controversy and the debates inside the Munich building where we were all headquarters. So I think it's more than just understanding American foreign policy. There's a tremendous amount to understand about the cultures of those countries to which we broadcast.
Mhm.
One point I make in the book, and it's a very legitimate point, is that if you're going to study Russian culture, political culture, regular culture of the latter half of the 20th century, you've got to engage with the programming and the research of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, because it is embedded there. You will see every issue, every angle, every approach. You can trace political developments. And every Russian writer of any note, minor or major, is somehow reflected in RFERL programming. And I think, that is a nominal part of the program, which I think leaves most Americans, most foreigners totally unaware of that. And again, I make this point that the repository of culture is astounding in the radios. And it's true for all the different language services. So I mean, I'm talking about the Russian one, but it's also true for the Polish, for the Ukrainian service, for the Czech service, for the Baltic services. I mean, so much of the culture and history of their countries is embedded in our VRL program, in particular, less so in VOAs, but still in VOA as well.
And I would give an example of how that the vault, you know, the archive of material can be used for a good public diplomacy purpose. When Ambassador Frank Ricciardone was U.S. ambassador to Egypt, he got VOA's cooperation in going into their vaults and finding a lot of the interviews of major cultural figures in Egypt over the past couple of decades. And they had these incredible tapes like the ones you were listening to for your services. And they made a CD. These were the days of CDs. It was a while back, of these interviews. It was a beautifully packaged CD of interviewing, you know, the most famous singers and the most famous film directors and writers in Egypt. And they distribute them widely, certainly among, you know, the sort of more upper educated strata of Egypt. But I think if they had been able to produce those and mass produce them, a lot of people would have loved to have them because it's a treasure for the people in the country to have this record. And that's the only instance I can think of anyone making use of those resources as a form of public diplomacy. This is how this is your culture, and this is how we related to it. And here's a CD. Today, of course, the media are so different. I think that was eventually put online, as a matter of fact. So today, it would be easier probably to open these vaults and make them available as a good that you can distribute in the country. And I don't know if anyone's even talking.
I think that has been done in Poland and maybe other countries in Central Europe. I'm sure that it could have been done with a lot of the Russian materials, but they're available online. So a lot of my Russian friends have gone on the Open Society and been able to listen to programs. And one of the senior editors of Radio Liberty today, Ivan Tolstoy, has done a fantastic job of culling the archives and producing programming today, which is 20 years ago this week, Radio Liberty produced this, or 50 years ago this week. These are the programs, and they are wonderful cultural programs. I mean, if you want to go back to the 1950s and listen to Trotsky's A Widow, talk about politics, there she is on Radio Liberty. You want to listen to Stalin's daughter, Svetlana Dilueva, reading from her memoirs, there it is on Radio Liberty. I mean, or Alexandra Tolstoya, the daughter of Leo Tolstoy's voice was very present in the 1950s. I mean, these are cultural artifacts that really are astounding. And I think more can be done with them, Martha. You're absolutely right. But I think there is the availability. There are about 40,000 or more Radio Liberty Russian language programs available online. And I would sometimes find myself, as I was doing research, just getting so carried away listening to them that, sort of my whole day went with sheer entertainment rather than actually getting anything written, because they were that much fun to listen to. And I would love to hear voices really from the past that are so important. I can just cite a couple of just quick examples for those who, the three greatest or the three most well-known Russian bards, Bulata Kujava, Vladimir Vysotsky, and Alexander Gadich, have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of programs on air where they talk to their listeners, where they sing their songs. It is really a collection of astounding, and I would wager no one else in the world has that collection. VRL did it and did it so well. So I think they're precisely what you're saying. There's a lot of opportunity to make that known.
You and I think, I will stop and open it up in a minute, but I just want to comment that you and I are like-minded, I flatter myself, in understanding the huge importance of good cultural programming. You simply cannot hammer people with the news all the time. The news is essential. And I think in our day and age, pushing back against, all the disinformation and all the garbage that's flowing out there, it's essential. It's an absolutely essential function. But whenever there's any breathing space, in Indonesia or, in parts of Africa where VOA does surrogate news, but there's also some breathing space to do other kinds of programs. And I'm concerned that we don't talk about our own culture in any critical or comprehensive way that would be meaningful to others. That's my hobby horse, so I'll push that to one side. But we don't engage in cultural programming to a very effective degree. I think it's long been seen as fluff. But I've talked to so many people in the Foreign Service who said you can't talk about policy disagreements all the time. Sometimes you have to change the subject.
Well, just to remind people, that Voice of America, when I was there, was on the air 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We a night crew that did a fresh newscast all night at the top of the hour. We had about 45 programs, weekly programs that ranged from Broadway shows, latest films, American theater, covering cultural events like Tanglewood or Spoleto Festival in Charleston, visiting groups. We had pop music, jazz music, you name it, and we had it. We even had a husband and wife team, very talented. They were actors in the Soviet Union before emigrating, who would translate current American plays, a scene or two, and then they would act it out as a radio play. Very beautifully done. And I described it in the book. I mean, this is something that when I tell people this is what VOA did, they sometimes look at me and totally astounded that we would spend time and money and effort to do a radio play of an American play. But that was the one way we could communicate a lot of the dynamism of what was happening in the country. So we did a lot, I would say. That was books, people, interviews. We had Baryshnikov on so frequently on talking about ballet, describing what he was doing in his latest production in Russian, and on and on. So that was Brodsky, the Nobel Prize winning poet, would be on VOA, reading his poetry, talking about his poetry, talking about American poetry. So I would say one of the great things of VOA in my time was precisely the amount of cultural programming we did.
Yeah, and unfortunately, we have replaced a lot of that with our commercial cultural exports, which, as I have argued, do not always cultivate goodwill overseas. But we sort of handed it over to Hollywood to communicate our culture to the rest of the world. But that's a subject for another day. I think that given this group, I should stop talking and let some other people pose their questions and talk to you, Mark. So I'll turn it
Okay,
up.
thank you. Thank you very much for those questions.
Am I calling on people, or Jeff and Michelle, or is somebody else?
As you like. I see Arch Puddington has his hand up.
Why don't you do it, Jeff?
I'll like do it because I'll embarrass myself by not seeing hands. But happy to do that. And then Martha, you become a co-discussant, if that's the right word. Arch, you have the floor.
Mark, I was wondering if you could go into it some depth. The controversy that emerged in the 1980s in the Russian service between, and this was shorthand, the staff who were followers of Solzhenitsyn, i.e., they were nationalists, and the staff who were followers of Sakharov, i.e., they were liberal Democrats. That was a controversy that got into the press, and among other things, I think it stimulated anti-Semitic or Jewish issues as well, because there were quite a few staff members, broadcast staff members at the RL, Russian service, who were Jewish. And I just wonder if you could explain the controversy a bit and then how management dealt with it.
Wow, we could spend, Arch, about the next 3 or 4 hours discussing all the permutations. And I was very often caught right in the middle of a lot of that. My chapter on Solzhenitsyn addresses precisely that issue, because we did do the broadcast of Solzhenitsyn. It did come under fire. The Washington Post even had an article about it. Many different opinions were voiced. I think, Arch, that sort of is the outer shell of a much deeper issue within the Russian political culture between, and I go into a fair amount of detail in the book. I could go into far more of it, obviously, between, the pull and tug of very different notions of what a post-communist Russia would look. Would it look more nationalist? Would it look more to Europe? Would it become more democratic? Would it go back to some of its more traditional political culture? We felt, and I think this reflects the management both of RFERL and of VOA, and we'd spent a lot of time discussing it at all different levels, is that the role of VOA and RFERL was to present all sides. It was not there to present one side and only one side, although there were people who took that point of view. But we had to present them within the context of a civil discourse in a civil society, so that you had a more conservative view, you had a more liberal view, or a leftist view, if you wish, but they had to be within the bounds. So yes, we had Solzhenitsyn view, but we had Lyudmila Alexeyeva criticizing that view and being on the air just as much as the other one. That is at least the approach I tried to do. I got pilloried, I got attacked, I got dragged into the mud. I mean, I had all the fun that you would expect, a manager in that situation to be, but I think we tried as best we could to kind of keep, we didn't go around canceling anyone. We would not put on anything on the air that was provocative. Now that's something that I think is important to know, that there was at RFERL in particular a pretty strict, well, VOA didn't even go that far, but at RFERL, those who might be more extremist in their views had to be curbed. And I think American management tried as best as it could to do that. But I think you're touching on all those points. And when I said earlier on that you can trace a lot of Putin's rhetoric today to those conservative views, yes, you can. They've gone, I think, way beyond what anybody that at least I knew at the radios would ever say. But I think some of the roots of that could be found there. I could tell a little story maybe that would illustrate. My first couple of months at Radio Free Europe Liberty in Munich, I had lunch with a number of older emigres, some Jewish refuseniks who had come out of the Soviet Union. And I was telling them a little bit of the sort of George Bailey, new director of RL, very much on the Reagan team, that, we need to stress religion, Russian history and so forth. And they're looking at me, Arch, in total, like I'm gone crazy. And they told me something that so stuck with me. They said, look, don't you understand? Communism is dying, but Russian imperialism and nationalism is growing, especially within the military and the KGB. Then one of the editors said very prophetically, when Soviet practice and Russian imperialism come together, the US will really be in danger. And that was said to me in 1982, 40 years ago. And now, of course, we see so much of that happening. So the radios, that was what made the radios so interesting, is that all the controversies were right there roiling in the hallways and in the meetings.
So thank you very much, Mark, and thanks for that round. Read Arch's book on Radio Free Europe. It's fabulous, and Michelle has put a link in chat. Martha, we have Larry Haas, Fritz, Jay in chat, a writer for VOA. I'll read his, and then Don Bishop. We'll see where we are. We only have 17 minutes left. And I know with Don Bishop, we're going to widen the lens, and it's going to be a question that we're going to hear from you too. I'd like to suggest, Martha, but let's see what we can do in 17 minutes. And Larry, thanks for your time. You have the floor.
Thank you, Jeff. I must say, I feel a little intimidated by asking a question, not just to Mark and Martha, but to you, Jeff, with your expertise here, but I'll do this as coherently as I can. Is it more difficult? I'm asking a historical question that brings us to today. Is it more difficult to do public diplomacy to the extent that we as a country, whether in Washington or at the grassroots level, have less of a sense of who we are and what our purpose is around the world? Was it easier during the time of the so-called Cold War consensus? Is it harder now because we live in an era where so many Americans don't want to be judgmental about different systems of governance? When we can't decide whether we went through this long debate with China, whether they were a competitor or an adversary. We've gone through this with Russia, whether there could be cooperation. We're going through this with Iran. We don't seem to have consensus on our number one challenge, and so on and so and so. So I'll leave it there. I'm just curious as to the relationship between kind of consensus around the country as to who we are and what we should be doing, and how effective we can be with public diplomacy.
So before you, thank you, Larry. That's a brilliant question. Before Mark and I suggest Martha jump in. Let's get Don Bishop in actually at this stage. Don, also one of the many on this call with deepest knowledge and experience. Don, you put a question in chat about the distinction and overlap between public diplomacy and journalism as method and means in these outfits and these media networks. Don, do you want to speak to that, or do you want to let your question in chat stand?
It's okay. The very first time I visited The Voice as a new USIA officer at the end of the 70s, I encountered the sort of feeling that, we're on the USIA organization chart, but we really don't want to be. And whenever anyone spoke of speaks of public diplomacy, the broadcasting professionals I know say, no, we're not part of public diplomacy. We are journalists. So I just, what's your take on this relationship between public diplomacy and journalism in the broadcasters?
Mark, you first. Thanks, Don.
Yeah, if I could do the questions in order, the first question about whether it's easier now or then, it was infinitely easier back in the 80s than it is today, I think, for a whole host of reasons. Partly because we back then believed in truth. We thought truth would win out no matter what. We did not live in a post-truth society. And because we were riding a wave, or the wind was to our back kind of pushing us along. Communism was dying. There was a tremendous openness to the West and the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. There was a desire to be part of the world. That is not the case now. Now the case is very much, we want to be separate. We are separate civilization, and on and on. So we are going against the grain now. We were going with the wave back in the 80s. And so that helped us tremendously. So very quick answer to your very, very good question. I think that is indeed the case, is that it was much easier. Now we're battling. We're not only divided, which we are, but when we were not in the 80s, there was, I make this point over and over again in the book, is that it didn't matter to us whether we went to a Democratic or a Republican congressman or a senator. The bipartisan support was very strong. There were outliers on each end, but there was very, very strong normal support within the middle range of that. But that's a great question, and one that deserves a much longer answer. But the second question is really very true too. I was at VOA, and of course my colleagues at VOA cast a very, USIA, they do their weird things. But I, as director of the Russian service, had a weekly meeting at USIA. So I always crossed the street and went to the USIA meetings, which were very helpful. But then the USIA people, the Foreign Service, tell me, what are these crazies doing? So there was a lot of also negative view on the part of USIA toward VOA. So I know that world quite well. And this is a bigger question, Martha, that I'd love to get your thoughts on. I write in the book at one point that we shed the burden of diplomacy and we could be journalists. We were not concerned whether or not our program enhanced détente. We weren't trying to do a U.S. policy program. We were trying to report what was going on. And if there were refusing, sitting in the gulag. We reported about them, whether or not that made the embassy happy or not. And I do bring in a number of examples, now declassified documents, where USIA actually tried to exert considerable pressure on VOA not to broadcast this writer, not to broadcast that writer, because something was happening in the more bigger diplomatic world that might upset this. I mean, Alexander Haig came to the VOA and said, don't broadcast these and these programs because President Nixon's going to the Soviet Union and he doesn't need this irritant. I mean, that's a document you can find and look up, and it's declassified, and there's nothing. That is the kind of pressure that did not exist in the 80s when I was there. You could go after Soviet Union all you want. I mean, nobody was there to do that. But that's a very tough question for the broadcasters.
Martha, you're muted. You're still muted.
I don't think the VOA or the grantees are 100% independent any more than the BBC is 100% independent. A government-funded media entity is going to be in some way subject to some kind of influence or pressure or oversight by that government. I think it's an illusion that VOA is totally an autonomous, independent news outfit. First of all, there aren't any independent, totally autonomous news outfits. They're all beholden to somebody, whether it's a corporation with a bottom line that invades against good news and good reporting, or it's a government that puts too much pressure. There's no such thing. And I call that the Watergate ideal, that, in the wake of Watergate two reporters bringing down a president, we had this romantic idea of the journalist as this totally autonomous being. And I think that has pervaded VOA over the years. And I would compare that to an older American idea of journalism that was developed during the age of the great newspapers, when every city had 3 newspapers. And there was a kind of workaday idea that you get the facts right, you separate editorializing from reporting, you try to keep your opinions out of it. Every newspaper would have its slant, but there was a sense of professional journalistic ethics that were developed within the profession of journalism. And it was more realistic. It was more down to earth. And I do think that this exalted idea of the journalist as an independent, autonomous truth teller who has no responsibilities to anybody has done a lot of damage. Where I look for that workaday notion of journalism today, I find it in the USAGM system among the better journalists, because they are conditioned by their own societies to know, as one woman put it to me in Indonesia, 80% independence is really good. If you have 80% independence, you can really do your craft as a journalist. She's not pushing for 100% or 200% independence, which is the self-image that American journalists have of themselves. And I think this is a source of friction between our domestic media and our overseas foreign language media, that somehow the domestic media represent this golden independence and glorious autonomy of the journalist. It ain't so. And the people who work for US AGM are in some ways much more realistic, and you could even argue better journalists. And the state of our own journalism is no longer a model for them. If they're trying to learn good journalism the old American way, where do they look?
So maybe, Martha, vice versa in times like these, for reasons you said. So we have Fritz. Fritz, you have 3. Could you pick one? The other 2 can go into chat. Maybe they're there already. And then Jay, our VOA writer colleague, yours, because you're not in a position to join us by audio, I will read. But Fritz, you have the floor. And good to be with you. Good to see you.
Fritz, I believe, is now possibly in a car. I don't think he's able to read his question. Jeff, do you want to just read the first one of the 3?
Can you read it, Michelle?
Sure.
Thank you.
I am trying to get up right now. Sorry. Okay, so Fritz says, our guest has fascinating insights into Russian nationalism, which is on exhibit in Ukraine. Would he please tell a couple of his cafeteria stories, including the dumb American one?
I sort of did say that story already, in the sense that that was the one where I learned in 1982 pretty much that nationalism was gaining and imperialism. And so therefore, so I really said that story, but there are many other anecdotes in the book that people can find that maybe will be also of interest.
Should I ask a different one then?
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
Sure. So one of the other questions was whether the emergence of the internet, how it affects the future of our FERL. More opportunities to reach a foreign audience or more impediments due to getting drowned out by so many different sources and disinformation?
Well, there's, first of all, of course, we were jammed. So we had our own problems with getting through because obviously our signals were jammed until 1988. I would say that there are different voices, and we had the advantage, I guess, as I mentioned earlier, that the Soviet Union, our listeners in the Soviet Union, really were seeking a Western voice. People would go out of their way to go to someplace outside of town where there was less jamming. I don't think that's the case now for a whole host of reasons, that there are many different voices. People have gotten spoiled. And there's a resistance to the West. I lived in Russia from 2008 to 2015 until I was thrown out and considered a persona non grata after 40 years of going back and forth. So I lived in the country, and it's a different country. It's not the Soviet Union. They got used to a whole different way of interacting and internet, and people are online and they watch YouTube. YouTube is the way in which Current Time and RFERL and VOA get to. And the reason YouTube hasn't been closed off because it's so popular within Russia that they don't dare close down YouTube, because it's just, they use it for hundreds and hundreds of other reasons. So I think, yes, we lived in a more innocent time. We lived in a more bipartisan time. We lived in a time where we believed in the power of truth. And I would also say, Martha, and I fully agree with you in your sense of how journalists are. We understood there were a set of responsibilities, that if you were the VOA, you were a journalist with a set of values and responsibilities that went with it. There was a law that helped you kind of be correct and proper. We had a very strict code of what is proper to say on the air, what you don't say. I mean, today's American media, I can't watch. I mean, it violates every conceivable notion of dignity, decency, and respect. On many different levels, which I find strange. We adhere to that, and RFERL had a very strict kind of code by which it would broadcast and what would not be considered improper, not reflective of values. But I think every media organization reflects its values. And I think that is at the heart of what makes it very important. We had our values of human rights. We had our values of individual freedom. We had our values of individual enterprise. And we try to communicate those values rather than selling America. It really irritates me when people say, well, you're selling America. No, we're not selling America in any way. It would be stupid, but we are trying to communicate a set of enduring values that we believe the society is based on. There's that I think is very much at the core.
So thank you. We are just about out of time, and I'd love to go to you, Martha, if I may, for final comments or observations or takeaways in this quick hour, from this quick hour.
Gee, how Mark seems to have had a good last word. So I'll just say that about the question about the internet, I think another big misapprehension of what this system represents now is that somehow it's horse and buggy media. You hear that, radios, I think the US AGM system at its best is more adroit at using media than any commercial outfit in the US, because they know how to choose the right platform to reach a certain population. They also reach populations that the commercial media would never dream of reaching, because there's no advertising revenue to be made there. And they also broadcast in languages that the American commercial media do not broadcast in, needless to say. So there's this idea, Jeff, you and I have talked about this. It's a sort of, I don't know why we need this system. I can get CNN International in my hotel in Abuja. There's this notion that because the American media are so widespread and vast, and English speakers all over the world can sometimes get into listening to our broadcast, that has nothing to do with what the system does. It goes into places like rural Cambodia, or until they were thrown out of Cambodia. So it's that aspect of it. It's the invisible part of it that's visible to the rest of the world that I really think needs to be drummed into a few heads.
So thank you, Martha. A few quick remarks on my side, and then we close out. What a wonderful group, and Larry and everybody who contributed. And those who didn't get a chance, like, if I may say, the legendary Gene Parda, who knows more about audience research than anybody in these closed and difficult and demanding environments. Let me say that if you didn't see it or haven't read it, look in chat at Martha's book on popular culture and public diplomacy, America's image abroad. Read Mark's book. It's fantastic. I have it on Kindle, so I can't hold it up as one does. Mark, do you have a copy there at hand so that we can see the cover page? Or someone, sorry to trouble, but I can't do it. I'm on my, there we are. Martha, we're good, Mark. We're good. Sorry to impose. Martha, thank you so much. Buy the hard copy, read it as I did on Kindle. I'm going to tell you that apropos your remark, Martha, at the top on, if you want to know hotspots, see what, well, the then Broadcast Board of Governors is closing. During my time as president of RFARL, there was a strong push to close the service of Ukraine because the transition was complete and Russia had evolved as a normal and manageable country. That was a decade ago. Good heavens, I'm glad that we pushed back a little bit and managed to keep the Ukraine service open. I would like to suggest that we have Mark and Martha, when Martha can be from Boston and Mark from Texas and Washington, for an in-person meeting, let's say first quarter 2023. I think with this group, there's so much more to discuss. Let's break bread, have a glass of something. And Larry, the question you asked, I'm not flattering you. There are a number of good questions, but this really deserves a much deeper dive. And then penultimate, I have to do this. My least favorite part. Thank you for joining American Purpose. Michelle is smiling. Become a member of American Purpose. We depend on your support. You have family, friends, neighbors. The link is there. Spread the word. We like culture. How about that? And history and all these things in addition to current politics. But Martha, what a beautiful job. Thank you for your work in this area. Mark, congratulations. It's a pleasure to read for the reasons I said at the top. History, content, your own experience, storytelling. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thanks everybody for coming today.